today's session, title of the subject, that is A Patient at the Crossroads, is the title of one of the books by Dr. Alok Pandey. And uh, I'm sure anybody who has turned to Sri Aurobindo and the Mother and has tried to take interest in his teachings is familiar with Dr. Alok Pandey anyway. He's a psychiatrist by qualification, and much of his career was spent with the Indian Air Force. But then he tried to take retirement from there as early as possible so that he could more directly do exactly what he was made for, the type of work that the Mother expected him to do. And that is what he has been doing for many years now, since he took retirement from the Indian Air Force. He's one of the most gifted, much loved, and much admired exponents of the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother, which he has done both in speech and in writing. In writing for a journal which he was more or less instrumental in establishing and starting, that is the New Approaches to Medicine and Health, which continues to go strong, and writing also several books. And apart from that, he speaks extensively all over the world. He is much admired and loved, not because he has some skills of oratory. It's not the skills that matter in this area. What matters is that he is able to do what he's doing with the right motive, in the right spirit. And therefore, when he starts speaking, he becomes an open channel, a completely unobstructed channel for transmitting the words of the Mother. So that's how he is able to come up with a very spontaneous expression of whatever he's saying. And with me, of course, he has at least a triple relationship. Firstly, we both belong to the medical fraternity. Secondly, we have the same gurus, Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. So he's a Guru Bhai. And last but not least, I have learnt a lot from him and have been inspired by him a lot. He has been on the path visibly on Sri Aurobindo's and the Mother's path longer than I have been. And even today, if I have a question, I would much rather turn to him for an authentic answer if I want the answer from someone in flesh and blood rather than anybody else. Now, in this book, Patient at the Crossroads, he's talking about the dilemma that patients often face today. Dilemma because of the fortunate development that after independence, there has been a slow, but all the same, certain revival of a sense of national pride. And therefore, the type of attitude which much of the educated elite, who are the opinion makers of the country, much of them had the opinion when the British left us that modern medicine has everything useful that the patient can turn to, and that all the other ancient Indian systems are full of some superstitions, some irrational beliefs, and are being practiced by quacks, and so on and so forth. That was the type of feeling that much of the educated elite in the country had. Whereas, fortunately, the knowledge remained alive all the same. The knowledge of ancient Indian systems remained alive, partly through what was passed on as folk knowledge from generation to generation. And that's why we refer to that as the grandmother's prescriptions. And those grandmother's prescriptions have some basis, some foundation in the most ancient system of medicine in the world, and that is Ayurveda. So they had that foundation there. Secondly, our culinary practices also made extensive use of that knowledge, because food is an important aspect of preserving health, promoting health, and also treating disease in Ayurveda. So the type of effects that different spices would have and so on, which we incorporate in the diet, changing them with season, changing them according to the disease that a person might have, was also folk knowledge passed on from generation to generation. And then, of course, we had some very learned scholars who, in spite of all the obstacles and in spite of all the prejudice that the Western presence here tried to create, in spite of all that, they continued to study these ancient books and continued to preserve that knowledge. So the knowledge got preserved, but all the same, it was not looked upon with great deal of respect when we became independent. But after that, there has been uh, a slow turning to it. Now, what has been the result of it for the patients? The result has been, while this knowledge uh, has, as it deserved to be, been revived, respect for it has grown, not only in India, but all over the world. And the result is that the patient now can't sometimes make up his mind whether to turn to allopathy or to Ayurveda or some of the other systems, which system to turn to, and what to expect in terms of treatment. Now, here, as we learned from Dr. Bhaswati Bhattacharya some time back, it's not a question of either or. It's a question of both, because ultimately the truth is one. It is just that different systems of medicine have looked at it in different ways from different angles. And because of their difference in approach, difference in their underlying philosophy, sometimes they can't understand each other's language. Even the two systems can't understand each other's language. But someone who can go behind the surface, behind the terminology, behind the way we have looked at it, can see that they are actually looking at the same phenomenon and maybe emphasizing one aspect rather than the other. And therefore, there is, in fact, a possibility of making good use of both and benefiting from both. And therefore, it's not a question of an either or approach. If one were to generalize it, one would say that while allopathy goes to the end result of the disease and corrects it quickly by working on the end result, in ancient systems such as Ayurveda and yoga. In fact, the two are very closely related, because Ayurveda has used various aspects of yoga for the limited purpose of promoting and preserving and health and restoring health. Although, I mean, yoga is not essentially a system for that. So yoga is a system primarily designed for spiritual growth. And the fact that some aspects of it can be used for treatment is a is an application, and some purists would consider it a misapplication. That is, but all the same, I mean, it's not really true. It's not a wrong misapplication, because any excuse is good enough for turning to the spiritual path. And therefore, if the disease is one of those occasions which makes a person turn to yoga and then discover the deeper spiritual aspects of yoga through that route, there's nothing wrong with it. Sri Krishna has said in the Gita that one of the things that makes a person a devotee is artha, that is someone who is miserable. And one of the things that can make a person miserable is disease. And Sri Krishna says that all types of devotees are acceptable to him, including the artha, including the one who turns to him because of misery. So the person who is miserable because of the disease, if that person turns to yoga and through that discovers that this is a path that will take him closer to the divine, there's nothing wrong with it. And if he stops just by getting the health benefits, again, that is not a sin. Maybe sooner or later he'll realize that yoga is more than that, and that's okay. But at the same time, and what I was, let me, this was a bit of a digression. Let me return to where I left. Where I left was that Ayurveda plus whatever makes use of yoga, uh, this combination is which goes under the name of Ayurveda. Yoga, to that extent, has been incorporated into Ayurveda. It has become an integral part of Ayurveda. So, this uh, system of Ayurveda, what it does is to go deeper and tries to correct the cause of the disease at a deeper level. As we have seen in the lifestyle diseases, say, for example, in a disease like uh, hypertension, the person has a high blood pressure because the person has narrow arteries. These arteries have become narrow because of two things. One is the deposition of fatty substances, and the second is under stressful conditions, the hormones that we release, they have a tendency to constrict the blood vessels, and constriction will further add to the narrowing of the arteries. Now, this constriction takes place when we are under stress, but then a person who is under chronic stress he's experiencing those, that this can become more or less constant. And that is how the constriction also becomes more or less a constant feature, just as, the uh, relatively prolonged constriction of or contraction of the muscles which go together. Constriction of the blood vessels is also contraction of the muscles in the blood wall of the blood vessel. Contraction of the skeletal muscles of the neck is contraction of these muscles. Now, when these muscles contract in the neck and in this area of the head, the person gets a headache. If the same thing happens in the arteries become narrow, the person's blood pressure goes up. So, because of both these reasons, the person's blood pressure tends to stay at a higher level. Now, what do some of the medicines that are used for treatment of high blood pressure do? The medication, which comes to us from the modern system of medicine, modern scientific system of medicine, which we generally call allopathy. Uh, these drugs, they widen up the blood vessels, they open them up. So this narrowing had raised the blood pressure, widening them up brings down the blood pressure. Something similar happens in case of say diabetes. The person's is not making enough insulin, or the insulin has become ineffective. So you give insulin or something which acts like insulin from outside, the blood sugar which had gone up comes down miraculously, instantaneously. And the one tablet which you gave to bring down the blood pressure, it has a limited duration of action. When that is over, you take another dose. Insulin or whatever one takes to bring down the blood glucose, that has a limited duration of action. When that action is over, to prevent the blood sugar or the blood pressure from going up, you give another dose. So you keep doing that. But then, how did it begin in the first place? As a result of a combination of factors, the eating too much of the wrong types of foods in quantity that was too much, and thereby putting on weight, remaining physically inactive, which increased the tendency to put on weight, putting into the body harmful substances like tobacco and alcohol, and uh, as a result of that, uh, doing further damage to the body, sleeping at the wrong time, not for long enough, and not having a peaceful sleep, that further adding to the uh, metabolic changes which take us towards some of these lifestyle diseases. And last but not least, mental stress. Now, all these things put together over started doing damage. The damage continued for quite many years without the person even knowing that this damage is happening. So it kept on happening silently till this gradual accumulation of this damage over decades finally started manifesting as one of these diseases. Now, one of the wonderful things that has been realized now in modern scientific medicine is that while this damage takes place over a few before we realize, it is possible to reverse it. Reverse it means go in the opposite direction, go towards healing. But then something that happened over several decades cannot go back in a day. So if we correct the lifestyle, correct those things which led to this disease in the first place, gradually it starts reversing, but that reversal takes time. But then till what? To prevent further damage, to prevent the complications of that damage, like say the person has diabetes, to prevent damage to the eyes or damage to the kidneys, it's good to maintain the blood sugar at a reasonably normal level. So that insulin or oral hypoglycemic agents can do much better. The same way, high blood pressure increases the risk for stroke. Uh, the high blood pressure will not come down through lifestyle modification in a day. The damage took place over decades, and therefore, till the damage starts reversing, it's better to using that medication. So, it's a combination that works best. And Uh, One example which I may repeat, uh, which I gave probably some time back, was that suppose your car breaks down and uh, the car is not running. So what one does is to get hold of a few young boys who will push the car up to the workshop. Now, if it takes too long to reach the workshop, when one set of boys is tired, we get another set of boys till we reach the workshop. And in the workshop, the defect will be corrected. Now, the tablets that we take for high blood pressure or diabetes are like those boys. They at least keep the car moving. But that is not the ultimate solution. The ultimate solution will be found in the workshop where they'll go to the root cause. What is it that made the car stop? But till we reach the workshop, those boys are very useful. So, in the same way, till we are able to get to the root and correct the root problem which is at the root, which will uh, take time to find the solution and take time for the solution to act. Till that time, and these tablets, which are like these boys, the way the boys get tired, the tablet's duration of action is over. So another tablet, like another set of boys, till that time, this is useful. So this is not an either or approach. And then what is more important also is that the that modern medicine has now also realized the mind body relationship, which means that in any disease, irrespective of what the disease is, once we give treatment, the treatment is acting not just because of the pharmacological action of the drug. Treatment becomes effective also because the person has faith in the system of medicine to which he has turned, faith in the doctor to whom he has turned, faith in the treatment that he's taking, and above all, the person has faith that my body is capable of healing, it can correct itself. So, all this adds up, and that is what makes the person recover. Because if that confidence is not there, then the drug will be either ineffective or less effective. In case of antidepressants, it has been found that more than 40% of the effect of an antidepressant is because the person believes that this tablet will make me recover from this depression. Now, how do we know this? Because even if you do not give the active drug, instead of the antidepressant, you give a placebo. Placebo which just has some sugar or something in it, but looks exactly like the same tablet as the antidepressant. The placebo is at least 40% as effective as the actual antidepressant. So, and that to some extent applies to other diseases also to some extent, not to maybe to that extent as in mental illness, but it applies also to other uh, illnesses. Part of the effect is because of this. Another thing which brings out this contrast between the person having this faith and not having this faith is in terminal illnesses. If the person has a strong will to live, if the person is waiting for a particular milestone, like say his birthday or a child's marriage or something like that, then somehow the person having a strong will to live and having developed this strong aspiration to live at least till this milestone is over is generally able to reach that milestone, and soon after it the person may die. On the other hand, if somebody has given up the will to live and developed what one might call the wish to die, this person dies very early. So mind has a profound effect on the body, and this is what in scientific medicine we call the mind body relationship. But in fact, it is not the mind body relationship, it is the soul mind body relationship. Because the mind is eventually able to transmit, to the extent we allow, the effects of what is behind the mind. Mind is a manifestation of the divine, and the representative of the divine that we have in us is the soul. So, but since we are not aware of the soul, since we don't turn to the soul often enough, there's a barrier between the two, and we tend to look upon ourselves through the filter of the mind, which in turn is basically driven by the ego. Now, That is what gives us a sort of feeling of as if this is the complete picture, me, which arises from the ego, and me having a body and a mind. So that gives us a picture which is apparently complete, but actually incomplete because it doesn't look at what is behind the body and the mind. That is the soul, of which this body and mind are instruments or manifestations or a visible form. Now, if the person is has developed this confidence, then his mind is able to access a little more of this higher influence. If on top of that, the person also has confidence that a higher power is with him, which means and knows that somebody else is praying for him, that also helps. And the other person praying can have also an influence through this unified field of consciousness. And the result is that the effect of prayer by others, prayer by the healer, prayer by the patient gets added to the effect of the person feeling through the limited mind that this treatment will be effective because I'm doing something which is going to be useful. All this put together contributes to the treatment. So we find that through an alternative route, gradually in modern medicine, we are once again turning towards this a type of a holistic approach. Just look upon the immediate treatment as the sole treatment, but is looking at what can further add to the efficacy of this treatment through a subtle influence through agents which are completely intangible and non physical in nature. So, when we are using, say, a tablet to bring down the blood pressure, to bring down the blood sugar, we are acting on the end result, but then it can have further ramifications which can harness this higher force. And then on top of that, if the person also undertakes at the physical level changes in the diet, exercise, sleep, etc., smoking, drinking, and all that, then over time, the damage which had been done can start reversing. And after some time, the person may find that either the person needs a smaller dose of the drug or doesn't need the drug at all. So the two approaches are not really mutually exclusive. They can complement each other. And therefore, when the patient is at the crossroads, not able to make up his mind what to do, the a little intelligent understanding of the two systems working uh, in different ways, same goal, and not having mutually exclusive approaches, mutually exclusive uh, sources of uh, turning to the healing mechanisms of the person can make use of. So this is the book, Patient at the Crossroads. And I can start with what I have marked in this book as an inspired passage, which is on page 177. In this, let me give a little background. He's talking about the influences that take place across physical media, something which we have been talking about in consciousness based medicine and prayer and healing and so on. So he's talking about those, about a distant mental interaction on living systems. And then he's talking about a study done recently by Rupert Sheldrake, where he surveyed all of the mainstream scientific journals in physics, chemistry, and biology, and they looked at parapsychology as well. He looked at the incidence of randomized double-blind protocols. What he found is less than 2% of the mainstream scientific studies were making use of the gold standard, while in the parapsychology literature, the figure was very high, something between 60 and 80%. So it's as if the parapsychologists are playing the game better. They're trying to conform to the rules, but the rules keep shifting. So here, what he has pointed out is that any study which is done in the area of what modern science does not consider scientific enough, this study is scrutinized with a microscope, whereas the mainstream scientific studies, even if they're not following strictly the double-blind protocol, are overlooked and accepted as a part of mainstream medicine. Then now comes that inspired passage with that background. These then are some of the early hints of the direction science intends to take in the future. But one thing is certain, science and its methods can take us thus far to the doors of the consciousness which stands at the foothills of the temple of the beyond. Neither science nor religion, neither philosophy, nor even occult knowledge can take us further. For beyond it are tracts of knowledge and power that do not lend themselves to thoughts profaning touch. So now here he's pointing out the limitations of anything which is based on the human mind, based on the human intellect, be it modern science, be it parapsychology, or be it occult knowledge, be it even religion or philosophy. None of these can go beyond a certain point, and beyond it are tracts of knowledge and power. Beyond all these are tracts of knowledge and power that do not lend themselves, which means that they are not amenable to, they are not susceptible to thoughts profaning touch. Thought as if, reduces in some way the sacred character of the divine touch, which only makes total and complete truth possible and accessible. So all these human constructs, mental constructs, typically human constructs, have a profaning touch. They sort of defile it, make it less sacred or even profane. Peep we can and peep we must doesn't mean that we should not continue to use these instruments which we have been given, which we trust. They can be the beginning, but they need not be the end of the process. Peep we can and peep we must. But if we are serious about stepping farther and climbing the summits of the hidden regions of consciousness and explore its multi layered, many tiered mansion, then we must shed our mental attire that is woven of the mixed tissue of doubt and seeking. We must take a leap of faith and with courage light up the fire of aspiration that can lead and open to the eyes of the soul. It is that which can understand and learn the law of surrender, carrying us to where none can live nor breathe, who has shed not the stain of desire and slain not the adversary that always comes between our sight and the absolute truth, the ego. Let's hope this too shall come to be one day, and man will no longer be merely a scientist or a philosopher, but holding the truth in his purified bosom, declare that thou art divine Tattvamasi. Now, this is an inspired passage, as you can see, and what it is taking us is beyond all mental knowledge and telling us that this can be the beginning but need not be the end. Eventually, we end with the methods of the rishi or the seer, that is, an intense aspiration, aspiration that is persistent, and that in turn leads us to the eyes of till we are able to see with those inner eyes, the Divya Chakshu, as Sri Krishna calls it in the Gita. It is faith and courage that sustain us. Because once that has been seen with the Divya Chakshu, then faith is no longer necessary. Then it becomes a part of that higher knowledge which this person has acquired. But to sustain that faith, in spite of all the doubts and questions that the mind might create, it needs an intense aspiration and also the courage to keep walking the path which may seem completely contrary to common sense, completely contrary to common ordinary beliefs. So we must take a leap of faith and with courage light up the fire of aspiration and that can lead and open the eyes of the soul. It is that which can understand in the law of surrender. That again becomes an important part. Aspiration, rejection of all the doubts and questions coming from the mental level, and surrender. Carrying us to where none can live nor breathe, who has shed not the stain of desire and slain not the adversary that always comes between our sight and the absolute truth. So, that also, along with this intense aspiration and concentration, leads because of this exclusive uh, attention to only one thing, it slays desires. And therefore, it cannot be compatible with it, does not come to one who has shed not the stain of desire and slain not the adversary that comes between our sight and the absolute truth. The adversary, the ordinary mind, full of its doubts, questions, reliance on the intellect, and other negativities. and which are all summed up in one word, the ego. These are all negativities, all these doubts, questions, excessive reliance on the intellect. All these are also a part of the ego. So let's hope that now this is an optimism keeping with in keeping with the teachings of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Let's hope this too shall come to be one day. All these adversaries will not no longer be the norm, and man will no longer be merely a scientist or a philosopher, but holding the truth in his purified bosom, declare that thou art divine, Tattvamasi. Now, this is the other side of the ego. While the ego may seem compatible with Aham Brahmasmi, I am the divine, but then uh, from that higher vision, from where comes Aham Brahmasmi, also comes quickly, spontaneously, and immediately Tattvamasi, you are also that, you are also divine. Now, that is the breakdown of the ego barrier, the collapse of the ego boundaries. So, when that happens, then the person has one visible, palpable manifestation of having become one with the divine, which we heard in that devotional song, Chetna ka ghul jana, our consciousness merging, dissolving in the consciousness of the divine. So, this was one passage, an inspired passage. Turn to some other important passages. This one is on page 191. This seems to be, this passage is not so much related to medicine, but seems more to do with the spiritual path. Balance of energy between receiving and expending. The proportion has to be kept between the receptivity and the expenditure. That is receiving the divine influence and then also spending it. What does spending it mean? Using it to reach, sharing it. It has to be kept between the receptivity. It's a kind of harmony which must be established. Only some people have an almost instinctive power of attracting towards them the vital forces or absorbing them, the universal vital forces, I mean, and so they make up their expense as they go along spending. These people can produce much more than others, some of them in certain conditions like sleep or a kind of repose or relaxation, can accumulate forces and later they exhaust them, so to say, in their activities, and they must yet once again charge the battery afterwards. This is already a much less favorable condition. Some don't know how to receive the forces at all. These live on the energies concentrated in the body, for there is some concentrated energy in all the cells of the body. They live upon that, but after some time, they are drained out completely if they don't know how to recuperate. When they have spent all the energies which were concentrated inside them, either they fall ill or they never recuperate them. So, this cannot last very long. It lasts the average lifetime of human beings. And yet, at the end of a certain number of years, they are no longer able to make the same effort or to produce as much, or above all, to make any progress. So, here there are two phenomena Dr. Pandey has talked about. In the first one, people who receive, particularly during sleep, the vital forces, the life force, and then expend it regularly. The other is those who don't receive these forces at all, but depend upon what has already been concentrated in the body, and they keep spending it. And the result is that there comes a time when they are no longer able to make the same effort, and that is what the process of aging is about. When one knows sometimes just 2 or 3 minutes are sufficient to recuperate the energy spent over a long period, only one must know how to do it. So, this process of replenishing, receiving more from the universal energy, uh, can be very brief and quick and efficient if one knows how to do it. But those who draw back upon themselves, who turn and double up on themselves, cannot do this. One must live all the time in a very vast and very expansive consciousness, which means in a consciousness that has expanded enough for the person to become forgetful of oneself as an individual. So, self forgetting is the key to that expansion. Something which extends very homogeneously and quietly, as when the tide is at its height and the water spreads like this quietly, that's the impression. The vital must be like that, then one is open to the universal forces. Now, Dr. Alok Pandey is again and again talking about the vital here rather than the mental, because as an collaborator as well as an adversary, the vital is far more important than the mental, because much of our life runs on the basis of the vital, and if it is transformed, if it's harnessed for the right purpose, vital can be a very powerful collaborator on the spiritual path. When one has this capacity in his own consciousness, for example, you go for a walk and come to a place which is somewhat vast, like the seashore, or like a great plain or the summit of a mountain, a place where the horizon is fairly vast. Then, if you have this kind of physical instinct, which suddenly makes you as vast as the horizon, you have a sense of infinity, immensity. And the vaster you become, the quieter and more peaceful you become. I'm sure most of us have experienced it sometime or the other in those natural surroundings where you are in an area where you can experience that immensity, get a glimpse of the infinite nature of the divine from the vast expanse of the sky or the mountains at a distance or a vast expanse of greenery, uh, to some extent, even in a big golf course for that matter, which seems to run sort of as far as the eyes would go. And all that also makes us, by putting us in touch with this vaster reality in which we become just one little dot, insignificant dot, that by helping that process of self forgetfulness in that immensity, it makes us uh, more peaceful, more peaceful because we are in touch with the one who is always at peace. It is enough for you to have a contact with nature like that. So that's how being frequently enough in this type of surroundings, uh, maybe even looking at a sunrise or a sunset, uh, helps us s- spiritually as well as physically. It replenishes the energy, which will also help us stay healthy and become healthier. There are many other means, but this one is very spontaneous. There's also when you see something very beautiful, you can have the same thing, a kind of inner joy and an opening to the forces. And so this widens you and fills you at the same time. There are many means, but usually one does not use them. Naturally, if you enter into contemplation and aspire for a higher life and call down the forces from above, this recuperates your energies more than anything else. But there are numerous methods. This passage, which I was reading out, actually is a passage from the Mother, and it's from the Complete Works of the Mother, Volume 7, page 71. Now I turn to another page, page 86. This chapter from which these pages are starts with the play between the forces of darkness and light, because we keep emphasizing the forces of light because that is more comfortable and also more positive. And the forces of darkness actually cannot influence us unless we allow that little chink, that little opening to them. That is our best shield, because the forces of light and darkness, good and evil, forces that will animate our consciousness, take it down, those forces are all around us. And we cannot stop those forces from being there. What we can do is to build up a spiritual armor, a shield, which will not make it possible for the negativities, the dark forces to affect us. And how to not let that chink, that little crack, develop in that spiritual armor, which is what is important. And maybe that is something which will come up in this chapter. This play between the forces of darkness and light, their struggles and conflicts have been recognized through all ages of mankind. The role of the forces of darkness, adverse and hostile, in bringing about illness is also known. The role of certain spiritual forces in testing the human soul in its upward march by creating difficulties is also widely acknowledged. So, illness is only one particular example of these hostile forces acting, but they can act in many other ways and create difficulties for the person who is on the spiritual path. The effects of these forces are both psychological and physical. The forces of darkness deplete our energy, create disorder in our body and mind, and take the form of various diseases and illnesses. They create quarrels and disharmony not only from within the organs but also disrupt the peace and harmony outside, giving birth to quarrels, misunderstandings, confusion, and rupture between individual groups. The forces of light, in contrast, bring peace and harmony and light wherever they act. They bring balance and unity, but not through a mechanical and regimented uniformity or propaganda. They bring a deeper unity of the heart, reaching out to another heart of thoughts and feelings, acting in unison, of a will not divorced from the light of knowledge, but one with it. They bring sincerity and purity where now there is only hypocrisy and artificiality. They give birth to hope and faith, charity and love, kindness and compassion, and by so doing, free us from our limited ego self and release in us the delight of being that is the healer par excellence. So, the spiritual and the uh, health related issues, they get mixed up in a completely inseparable manner. There's just a seamless extension from one to the other. You can move from the spiritual, go towards how it affects health, and you can start with health, which is our more common and ordinary concern, and see that that never gets far enough unless you turn to the spiritual. To trust the inner divine and leave oneself in his hands is the road to freedom from the entire chain of cause and effect. So, since our mind is limited, eventually it is the divine forces will work. I can stay healthy, I can heal. So that trust is most important. The trust the inner divine and leave oneself in his hands. So when we are trusting the treatment, the doctor, the system of medicine, we are only trusting one of the instruments created by the divine. Because all these are also instruments. Even the pill that is we are swallowing, even that is a manifestation of the divine. That pill became possible because somebody was inspired by that higher force and created that pill. To trust the inner divine and leave oneself in his hands is the road to freedom from the entire chain of cause and effect. The divine grace cuts through these, and it can do so because ultimately all the forces owe their origin to the divine and are linked to him. Faith and surrender to the grace are therefore the highest wisdom and the supreme science. Let me make it a little lighter. Uh, there is a sort of story, may not be absolutely genuine, but all the same, it drives home a point, which the cancer surgeon Bernie Siegel has talked about. There was once a cancer patient who was assured by the divine that I'll save you, don't worry. So the next day, to this person came a practitioner of an indigenous system, say like Ayurveda, and told him that we have a treatment for you. Will you like to try it? He said, no, I don't want to try it. God will save me. Then came a nutritionist who said that we have a wonder diet which cures cancer. Will you try it? He said, no, God will save me. And then came the practitioner of modern scientific medicine. He says, there's a new drug that has just been developed. We want to do some research on it. Would you like to volunteer and be? And the drug we tried on you, it could be turn out to be a wonder drug which will cure you. He said, no, God will save me. And then the patient died. So when the patient got up there, he told God, you had told me that I'll save you. You didn't. So he said, well, I sent you one by one who all offered or the other, which uh, would have saved you, but then you kept refusing all of them. So the divine works through these instruments, through these agents, but ultimately it is the divine that works. So that's what Dr. Alok Pandey is saying here. The divine grace cuts through these, and it because ultimately all the forces owe their origin to the divine and are linked to Him. And therefore, faith and surrender to the grace are therefore the highest wisdom and the supreme science. So it is these cosmic forces in whose net our ordinary normal lives are caught that thrive in an individual who feeds them by his substance and his consciousness. So, we have all these types of forces, positive and negative, adverse forces which are positive and forces which are adverse or hostile. But then which force will work depends upon which one we feed, which one we cater to. It is these cosmic forces in whose net our ordinary normal lives are caught that thrive in an individual who feeds them by his substance and his consciousness. The more we feed them by repeating a certain movement, say anger, the more they come back upon us. These forces of the universal nature keep the individual tied to certain limits. It is to these natural limits, so to speak, that we give the name normalcy and call them laws. But then one laws by trusting that higher force, which has another law of its own, which is beyond the mind. That is why every individual who tries to exceed himself must exercise a certain degree of control over the forces of universal nature, or else there is some likelihood of imbalance. Outside the range of universal forces operative in human nature, there are the hostile forces on one side and spiritual forces on the other. The adverse forces press upon nature and aggravate feelings such as lust, greed, ambition, vanity, anger, and doubt. The hostile forces throw upon us hopes of doubt, confusion, depression, a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, a total lack of faith and will. The person may even be driven to the brink of despair and suicide. These, of course, have the opposite effect. The spiritual forces have the opposite effect, the positive forces. They bring hope, increase light, peace, strength, and joy, creating health, harmony, and well being. That we should keep ourselves open with others, not allow which will let them work. Maybe another 10 minutes or so we can continue and then open to questions. Now, in this one, Dr. Alok Pandey is talking about one of the very recent and fascinating advances in modern scientific medicine, and that is gene therapy. Because of a faulty or unhealthy lifestyle, why is it that one person develops migraine, another develops high blood pressure, the third develops diabetes, and the fourth develops, uh, say, peptic ulcer? It's because the weak points in our bodies are different, and what the weak point is determined by our genes, or in Ayurvedic terms, by our prakriti. And the two are closely related. Many studies have now shown that the genetic makeup has a close relationship to the prakriti of the person. And therefore, one of the things that has become very fascinating and to some extent feasible is gene therapy, especially when the number of genes involved is just one gene or very small, then one can uh, try to correct that through gene therapy. While gene therapy is very fascinating, it in practice it is not only extremely difficult and expensive and requires a level of technology which may not be available everywhere, but apart from that, uh, an epidemiologist, Walter Willett, has in fact calculated uh, and gone into this in some detail and come to the conclusion that any day lifestyle modification wins hands down. That's a much better approach than gene therapy. Gene therapy is fascinating, but it's not really feasible or practical. Uh, it's lifestyle modification, and of course, yoga is the best way to get inspiration for that lifestyle modification. It is that which is far more effective than gene therapy can be. Now, let's see what Dr. Alok Pandey says in this. Uh, the kind of enthusiasm, this kind of enthusiasm, well, let me read the title itself. The title itself is pretty long, so and that will convey something meaningful. In the face of worldwide, in the face of worldwide enthusiasm for gene therapy, what then is the relationship between the spiritual and physical, if there is any at all? This kind of enthusiasm had been present earlier too with drugs and certain methods. It's not the first time that that type of enthusiasm has developed. Uh, in fact, the first time insulin was used and the picture of diabetes changed completely. It was wonderful. The first time uh, anesthesia became safe and one could do extensive surgery, there was great enthusiasm. So, all these major advances lead to a lot of enthusiasm and euphoria. But enthusiasm and hope are often outweighed by a reality check. The way, all the advances made in the first half of the 20th century got checked in the second half when the lifestyle diseases started emerging as major killers. But enthusiasm and hope are often outweighed by a reality check. Enthusiasts are often people who have a great faith in the method of physical science. But there's a fundamental flaw in this method itself. The very first fallacy lies in the threefold assumption, which is as follows. One, matter and physical world are the only reality. This assumption puts science within a box with fixed and rigid boundaries that are already beginning to crumble. So, this is the first assumption that is wrong, it's fallacious, and puts a limit on the physical methods in spite of all the enthusiasm that they generate. Which is what is this limit? What is this fallacy? That matter and the physical world are the only reality. So anything which is beyond what we can experience with the ordinary faculties does not exist. This is the only reality. So this actually limits science, but then this is a boundary which is beginning to crumble. Even science itself is stretching itself and trying, making those initial steps, fumbling steps towards emerging from this boundary. The way, a butterfly would do when it is breaking through that pupa in which has been resting for a long time. Initially, with its limited strength, it makes that effort. Making that effort, it grows stronger. And finally, when it has the strength, it breaks through it completely and emerges as a butterfly. So modern science is making those methods like that, still baby butterfly. This assumption puts science within a box with fixed and rigid boundaries that are already beginning to crumble. The second assumption, sensory evidence is the only proof of fact. This seals the boundaries with strong bars and is being increasingly questioned by fresh evidence. So, in science tends to depend on evidence which can be experienced at the sensory level. Ordinary senses or senses multiply, say, the power of the eyes may be multiplied by using a microscope, but all the same, the evidence which science trusts is essentially sensory. And that is considered the only proof of fact, which is again not really true because uh, there are levels of knowledge which are not accessible to sensory evidence. And human beings potentially have the faculty of accessing those channels of knowledge which are higher than the sensory experience, higher than the mind. Those are the methods that the rishis and the mystics across tradition have used. But because that is not the norm, there's a tendency to mistrust it. And science, particularly, has drawn that boundary that it would consider as proof only sensory evidence. The third assumption. Rational analysis is the only way of knowing the truth. This puts a lock on our own personal growth and our capacity to know and explore. We are beginning to discover that there is an intelligence, an inherent knowledge, and will in every element of the universe. So, rational analysis, which is a capacity of the intellect, very well developed in human beings, that is the faculty which we employ for analyzing our data collected through sensory means. So that is the basic method of science. Use the sensory means directly or after amplification, and that gives us data, and then processing rational analysis using the capacity to reason. And then you arrive at conclusions. But then this has been considered to be the only way of knowing the truth. This again limits the approach of science because this is not the only way intelligence can be looked at. As we were talking the other day, that even a molecule which knows where to go, find the right place, and then after it has done its job, where to send a signal for the next molecule to be able to do its job and build up a chain, that is also a type of remarkable intelligence, although we don't look upon it that way. So these are the three basic assumptions with any approach like gene therapy. These are three basic assumptions which limit any evaluation of a physical approach, a modern scientific approach like gene therapy, that matter and physical world are the only reality, sensory evidence is the only proof of fact, and rational analysis is the only way of knowing the truth. The universe is not only a material but also a spiritual fact. And these are two different orders of reality, and they're not disconnected and cut off from each other, as if the spiritual world has no bearing upon the material. In fact, it is the non material consciousness of the divine that became the material of the material universe. And this type of connection between the non material and the material continues to work on a miniature scale throughout creation. To some extent, one can say that the mind body connection itself is that type of a connection. Mind being a non material entity, a subtle entity, having a to and fro, two-way bidirectional relationship with a physical manifestation like the body is itself the type of connection between the non-material and the material, with which the creation of the material universe started. The non-material supreme consciousness becoming manifesting as the material universe. So the universe is not only a material but a spiritual fact, and these two very different orders of reality are not disconnected and cut off from each other, as if the spiritual world has no bearing upon the material. The spiritual, the material, and all the other intermediary worlds, with their forces and energies, all influence each other. And in this complex chain, the spiritual is the first cause, the base and support of all things, whereas material is the last, the result. So the sequence also remains the same as in the creation of the material universe, started with a non-material entity, the supreme consciousness, and the result was the result which followed this initial cause, the primal cause, the result was the material universe. And that continues to be so. Even when the result is physical, for example, the scientist comes up with a pill, the starting with the pill, which comes from the higher source, comes from a non-material source, it's filtered through the mind, which is non-material, and it is then that is translated into the material, that is the pill. So the spiritual is the first cause, the base and support of all things, whereas material is the last, the result. But in the material itself, there are several steps, and one may easily confuse any of these to be the final or sole determinant cause. So it's because of this long chain of reaction in the material uh, universe that we tend to look at that limited bit, and within that, treat one material event as the cause and the other as the effect of that cause. So it all remains sort of a big chain within the material, the way medical students study those long cycles like the Krebs cycle, etc., and metabolism, where this chemical, with the help of this enzyme, leading to this product, and this product in turn being acted upon this enzyme, leading to this the product. So it's an entirely a material chain. That chain is long enough to preoccupy our mind, and we forget that the initial cause was spiritual. But in the material itself, there are several steps, and one may easily confuse any of these to be the final or sole determinant cause. It's a top down view of things and not from below, above, or from the surface to the depth. Now, if we cut off all the rest and only adhere to material causes, then we have serious gaps in our knowledge and a fractured understanding of things. So, this itself, these defects become inevitable with this limited approach, an approach which does not look from high enough, looks from more from the horizontal rather than from the higher level. Thus, for instance, how are we to explain how an unconscious gene, unconscious within quotes, because the gene is not conscious and not unconscious. Every material entity has that supreme consciousness hidden in it. How are we to explain how an unconscious gene acts with such precision in steps so as to create a conscious thinking being? How do unconscious, again within quotes, and inanimate, again within quotes, chemicals create conscious living creatures? How do blind neurons, again blind neurons within quotes, create a foreseeing thought? What is the role of will, aspiration, faith, and love? Are these also genetically determined? Are they just a fantastic illusion created by the play of genes and the brain and body's neurochemistry? And if that is so, then what is the reliability of all our knowledge, evidence, analysis, and data? It means we are ultimately relying on certain chemicals in order to know other chemicals. But as we understand, chemicals are essentially incapable of intelligent analysis and knowledge. Besides, what is the cause and effect in a random world? What we observe instead is an intelligence, a conscious working, even an aim, if we may say, an intelligent working out in steps towards a goal, adapting a means to an end. So these chemicals are only a means to an end. Their beginning was in that consciousness, and they're driving towards a result that is determined by that consciousness. A recurrent pattern, rule and law, and mathematical order behind everything in nature. In other words, what is more likely to be true is the deep and profound ancient Indian seer sight that matter is born out of energy and force is born out of consciousness, and consciousness itself is inherent in the being. So, the starting point is consciousness, consciousness which knows and which can do. It knows, it wills, and it can act. And what does that lead to? Energy and force, like, say, the life force, energy like heat and sound and light and so on. But these are at a lower order as compared to that consciousness. They know very little and they can do very little. They manifest only a small fraction of that consciousness. What is more likely to be true is the deep and profound ancient Indian seer thought, that is the sight of the rishis, that matter is born out of energy and force is born out of consciousness, and consciousness itself is inherent in the being. If that sounds abstract, it is not, but it's just that we are not habituated to look at it that way. Then we can put it simply in this way: it is the formless spirit that has assumed a form. It is the limitless infinite consciousness that has become a limited and finite consciousness that we call life, and even an apparent consciousness that we call matter. But everything is pregnant with consciousness. Everything that has been created, be it matter, be it energy, be it a force like life force, it's pregnant with consciousness. It is full of that consciousness. There's a conscious intelligence far surpassing the human intelligence that is operating everywhere. So if we only widen our minds and in terms of what constitutes intelligence, the way a little molecule works can look like something far superior to the ordinary human intelligence. It surpasses the human intelligence. What we term our mind is itself one form and aspect, or even the result of the self limitation of the one infinite consciousness. But since here upon earth, all this is based upon matter, rooted in matter as it were, and hidden in matter as a limitless possibility, all seeming to be so heavily dependent upon matter, it has no independent reality, save as an epiphenomenon or a result of material processes alone? In other words, we can take three possible approaches to reality. So now come the three possible approaches to reality, including in this how we can look at genes and gene therapy in terms of these three ways of looking at realities. First, the physical world and matter are the only dimensions to study. If matter explains itself when we understand the chain of material processes by our material mind alone, then we can find ways to correct whatever goes wrong in this chain by just material means, thereby making ourselves free from disease and death. And since, according to this theory, everything is a question of genes and chemistry, we may also find a chemical means to change our mind, attitudes, beliefs, hopes, etc., and make man free of evil and suffering as well. This is an attractive hypothesis. But the big question here is that even if it were possible, is it really worth it? So then one may ask, who or rather, what am I, this I that wants to be free of disease, evil, and suffering? They're as unreal as the solidity of objects themselves. Solidity of objects is an illusion according to modern physics. There's much more empty space in a solid than what is solid. And one analogy that has been given is that if you were to consider the a big hall, not just a room, a big hall to be a magnified atom, then within that, the nucleus of the atom will be just like one little football, and probably the electrons will be like grains of salt. That is the type of uh, solid material will have the nucleus and the electrons orbiting around it. The rest will be all empty space. So they're as unreal as the solidity of objects. Besides leading to a dangerous form of genetic fatalism, this makes everything in life that is grand, noble, and beautiful at once worthless and meaningless. The question is, if at the end of things we have an atomic void waiting for us, is it worth the trouble to explore? Finally, it leads to serious gaps and the biggest of all unanswered questions: why there is something at all and not nothing? How is material existence born? How did creation arise in this meaningless void? So while I'm in the looking at gene therapy as just handling some uh, chemicals and manipulating in such a way as to achieve a desired result, which is in terms of chemical reactions, in turn leading to a correction of a physical defect in the body, and ignoring the deeper aspects of it, not only makes it look a very limited approach, but also question whether it is worth at all. Now, the second way of looking at the same phenomenon. Second, there's a spiritual reality other than the material, but both the spiritual and material are closed boxes, complete within themselves and with no meeting point or mutual influence. The soul comes from one box and steps into another for whatever strange reason, and then goes back to its home. Both run together like parallel worlds that cannot meet. Such a doctrine raises even more questions and further confounds the confusion. It does not fill the gaps but only widens them. The riddle only becomes worse. What we need has the spiritual self to enter at all into the material if it has nothing to do with it. So the riddle is now, what need has the spiritual self to enter at all into the material if it has nothing to do with it? If both are closed boxes, then how does it enter at all? What is the use of such a supernumerary, and what kind of experience must it take from the material world to which it neither belongs nor has no or any particular point of contact or any specific influence? So the second approach would be to say, acknowledge, yes, there is something non-material which is real, like the soul, but then that and the material are two independent entities staying their own boxes within the individual, having their parallel existence, the body functioning entirely in an autonomous manner as the body, having nothing to do with the soul. On the other hand, the soul just being there because it somehow got in when the person was coming from somewhere else in some other world, or whatever, or the person was getting born, somehow the soul managed to enter. It stays as an inert entity, as a parallel entity while the person is around. And after death, the soul, just being immortal, goes back to where it came from, having played no role while the person was here on earth. Now, this is the second. But then, if that was so, what was the need for this soul to enter into this material body at all? Was it just to imprison itself, or did it have any meaningful role? Now, the third way of looking at the same. Third, and this is the position of a comprehensive spiritual vision, experience, and thought takes. The spiritual and material worlds and all the intermediary ranges are interlinked in a single chain. The spiritual, or rather the highest levels of the spiritual, are the source and cause of all things, and are therefore most free, all knowing, and powerful. The material, or even further below, is the world that is most bound and therefore most resistant to change, least conscious, and least able to exercise a will of its own. Man in his present evolution stands somewhere between these two poles, but at a crucial point. So that is where the dilemma of man and the complexities of man come in. He's neither here nor there. He's at a juncture in evolution where he's between the two poles of being totally oblivious of the spiritual aspect, and on the other hand, incapable of living it. Man in his present evolution stands somewhere between these two poles, but at a crucial point. He can bring into his body, mind, and life the influx of a higher spiritual consciousness, knowledge, and power, and change things here, even physically, including the genetic imprints if that is necessary. Now, this is a key sentence that only man seems to have this capacity on earth. No other animals perhaps seems to possess that. Only man seems to have this capacity to have this perception of the link between the body and the soul. And with this, man is the only creature who can bring into his body mind and life. All are important. Not changing the body alone is not enough. Transforming the mind and making the life force work in tune of the soul, in tune with the soul. He can bring into his body, mind, and life the influx of a higher spiritual consciousness, knowledge, and power. That higher spiritual consciousness is both knowledge and power. Knowledge and the capacity to do, which is power. Power is different from force. Force can be blind, energy can be blind, but power is a self aware force, a force which is closely linked to the awareness. So, mind and life, so the human beings can bring into body, mind, and life the influx of a higher spiritual consciousness, knowledge, and power, things here in this world. Doesn't have to wait for going to some other world. It can happen right here and now on this world. Even physically, including the genetic imprints if that is necessary. So genes are just as amenable to this type of a transformation through the use of this higher force by channelizing it properly, which the human being is capable of doing, not just to get rid of disease, but this can be one of the side effects or byproducts of the higher goals with which the person embarks on the spiritual path. The person can change even plants, which means of gene therapy, treat chemicals, one can modify the expression of these genes through this process. And that is something which, again, modern science has gradually started acknowledging that apart from the genes, there is a strong, what they call epigenetic influence that is higher than the genes. Epi means is above. So, higher than the genes, there's an influence which can modify gene expression. And one of the concrete things, again, since science has a way of approaching things through physical means, one of the things that can modify genetic expression is the diet that we take. So, what we put into the body can take into the body, along with the chemicals, a certain type of consciousness, and that in turn is the way the genes will express themselves. So, modification of genetic expression is possible. That's an epigenetic phenomenon. And one of the ways to do it, which modern science is acknowledging now, is through diet. So he can bring into his body, mind, and life the influx of a higher spiritual consciousness, knowledge, and power. In things here, even physically, genetic imprints, if the can do it without direct spiritual assistance, indirectly it is always pushed by the spirit from behind to exceed itself and exercise new possibilities. So that evolutionary thrust keeps doing it indirectly anyway. But human being is the one who can do it also directly, which means become a collaborator of nature in the evolution. Then how much more would it do if it opens to a much greater power beyond mind, a power out of which mind and matter both are born? So when a person during visualization is visualizing a certain part of the body and trying to channelize the life force or the trying to activate the healing mechanisms in that part of the body, say looking at his angiogram and seeing that, well, these arteries are blocked. Now I'm visualizing a certain heat entering my body, melting this fat, and the arteries are opening up. Now the person is using essentially an imagery which is looking at only the physical and at the most the heat energy, but not the spiritual force. But if the person is able to couple this with a higher force, then how much greater this imagery can become, this visualization can become. So if the mind can do it without direct spiritual assistance, the way it happens in imagery and visualization, without direct spiritual assistance, indirectly it is always pushed. So indirectly it is again the same working, even when the person is doing it purely at the level of the mind, indirectly that force is working, but the person can also do it directly. And if you were to do it directly, then naturally much more would be possible. So something done in ignorance, uh, even if it is using the same source, will not be as effective as something which is done with that knowledge. Then how much more would it do if it opens to a much greater power beyond mind, a power out of which mind and matter both are born? But the means to open to that higher power is through an inner yoga and not by a technological manipulation of matter. So it cannot be done in a chemical laboratory, in a modern science lab, where you can manipulate the chemicals, where you can manipulate the genes, treating them as chemicals, as a collection of chemicals. But that is not what is going to bring about this opening to a higher power. That can be done through inner yoga. That can be done through the work that is within, the churning that goes on within the person. And that is how the genetic expression can be modified. But the means to open that higher force is through an inner yoga and not by a technological manipulation of matter. That is why we are less enthusiastic about things like gene therapy. We means those who are on the spiritual path, they're less enthusiastic about gene therapy, treating it as a purely a mechanical exercise. And epidemiologists like Walter Willett are also less enthusiastic about it for other reasons. They're less enthusiastic about things like gene therapy, which, though useful in their place, cannot give the ultimate solution since they are not the sole and final determining cause. The final answer lies elsewhere. So, with this, I can stop. I ended up reading the entire chapter on gene therapy because of the fascination it holds, and it was a short chapter. So, I went on, and that's how we reached 1 o'clock. But anyway, if there are any questions, I can try to answer.
I have a small question. Like we say that the patient is at crossroads, but is the doctor also at crossroads with Ayurveda and allopathy and multiple things of knowledge opening up? What about the healer? What about the doctor?
That's
If
a
you can
good question.
speak a little
Uh,
bit.
yes, that's a good question. And in that respect, there are different countries which have a different type of influence on the healer. By and large, the healers are doctors across systems are getting a little more open to other systems of medicine. Those trained in modern scientific medicine have started acknowledging more and more systems such as yoga and Ayurveda, whereas those who are into Ayurveda have also started taking some interest in modern scientific medicine, seeing that there is something valuable there and they try to understand it. So they've started looking at it. But the laws are different in different parts of the world. in some parts of the world, in the West, if a person understands another system of medicine, a system other than the one in which he was primarily trained through self study, he can synthesize them, bring them together, and practice both, the way people like Deepak Chopra have done. Or Dean Ornish and all, I mean, have brought in yoga. Deepak Chopra has brought in a lot of Ayurveda into his practice. Uh, but in our country, all laws are different. If a person has been trained in a particular system of medicine, unless he goes through training in another system and acquires a qualification, the person cannot practice both. So he basically is restricted to in practice to the system in which the person was educated. But that does not prevent the person from doing some subtle things which come from other systems. For example, a person who has been trained in modern scientific medicine, nobody stops him from, from praying for his patients or uh, using the mind body approach, which goes beyond mind body approach to the soul mind body approach, while trying to put his patients at ease, making them, giving them the confidence that they will get better, that they have potent self healing mechanisms which will make them get better. Nobody stops a physician trained in modern scientific medicine from doing that. What it stops him is from prescribing Ayurvedic drugs. But the other subtler approaches he can also use. And how much he will actually use them will depend upon his attitude. And if he's open to it, he will use it. If he's not open or at least ignorant, then he will not use it. But if he's openly skeptical, the way many still continue to be, then he will not only reject it, he will ridicule the patient for having used any of these approaches. That can also happen. And that's why patients sometimes try to hide if they are doing any such things. They don't tell the doctor about it because they feel the doctor might get angry. Why are you using these things? This is quackery. So all these different approaches do matter. And then what promotes another sort of thing, which this type of skepticism and an irrational attitude to practices other than modern scientific medicine, among those who have been trained in this system. Why I keep calling it, let me digress a bit, why I keep calling it modern scientific medicine and not allopathy? Because allopathy, actually, the term which allopaths themselves would not like to use for themselves. They would not like to call themselves allopaths. What does allopathy mean? Allo means foreign. Allograft is a graft which has come from a different alien animal, different type of animal. Now, allopathy means different. Now, who coined this term for modern scientific medicine? The founder of homeopathy, who himself was trained in modern scientific medicine, developed something against it, and then intuitively he got this uh, knowledge which led him towards developing homeopathy. And in homeopathy, the principle is that if something gives us symptoms of a particular type, then diluting that will help in correcting that disease. So if something gives fever, that same thing, chemical diluted more and more, will be able to correct the fever. So the treatment is similar to the cause. So in homeopathy, he said the treatment is related to the cause. It depends upon the cause. It takes a cue from the cause, and therefore it's homeopathy. In contrast, the other system in which he had been trained, modern scientific medicine, he says that in that the treatment is unrelated to the cause, and therefore he called it allopathy. It's unrelated. Now, who would like to be practicing a system of medicine in which the treatment is unrelated to the cause? Nobody would like to do that, not even an allopath. So that's why I keep using that modern scientific medicine. So returning again to that point, that what creates this type of an unhealthy attitude or skeptical attitude amongst practitioners of modern scientific medicine are many things. One is that it has gone into sufficient depth and detail in the scientific sphere for the person to develop an impression that perhaps nothing more can be known beyond this. So everything that is there to be known, allopathy already knows. So he develops that smug satisfaction by the time he finishes his studies. The second thing that promotes this is an inbuilt sort of a hostility or cynicism or aversion, whatever you may say, which has survived the colonial rule, which the intellectual colonialism to some extent still continues. So the person has mistrust of anything which is indigenous and has a great respect for anything which came from the West. Second thing. Third, and the very important factor which keeps this type of skepticism alive is the pharmaceutical industry, because it is not in their interest that anything which is done through the self-healing mechanisms of the body, which is costs nothing, that type of a treatment or that type of an approach should find a more prominent place in the practice of medicine. It's not in their interest. So pharmaceutical industry also continues to educate, or rather one might say brainwash, the doctors long after they have qualified from medical school. They might spend only 5 years getting their basic degree in medicine, but then for the next 50 years, they keep getting brainwashed by the pharmaceutical industry. And that naturally leaves some effect. So what basically is the treatment? The treatment is that modern scientific practitioners of modern scientific medicine should turn to the at least to the tool that they trust the most. Which is the tool that they trust the most? Rationality. If you turn to that, even then you will not reject the other systems, because when you are rejecting the other systems without knowing anything about them, that is one of the most irrational things one can do. To reject something which you know nothing about is itself irrational, and yet then you say that you are a great votary of rationality. So first know something about it, understand it, and then if you reject it, you are entitled, because at least you've done what Sri Aurobindo calls rejecting after understanding. So, Sri Aurobindo is very sort of emphatic on this, that if you accept something, it should be because you understand it. If you reject something, that should also be because you understand it. So first understand, then reject. Otherwise, you are being irrational to calling yourself rational.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Actually, there is a certain kind of closeness when we meet allopathy doctors about other systems and spirituality and things like that. So that's why it's very difficult to convince them that other things also work. And the allopathy model is the model. That is the understanding. All other models are quackery or non-acceptance. That's why this question. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Most welcome. Thank you. Thank you for raising that question. So you say this is Parkinson's law at work, in a way. Work expands to fill the time available. Uh, the speaker was not there, but somehow the talk expanded. But then we had a great deal of the presence of Dr. Alok Pandey through his book. So I'm glad the session was still based on what he might have said.
All right, then there are no more questions. So it's time to close. So thank you everyone for joining in. And we end with a moment of silence. Thank you.